Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Hello and welcome to the London part of the show. I'm Jo Coburn, and with me for the duration today, Andy Slaughter, Labour MP for Hammersmith, and Chris Philp, Conservative MP for Croydon South. Welcome to both of you. I want to start with the latest on Brexit. On Friday, the Prime Minister made her latest keynote speech on leaving the EU, whilst the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn earlier in the week announced Labour's new position on the customs union. First of all, though, Chris Philp, the Prime Minister says there will be less access to the single market than we had before. Is that a good thing for business?
Well, I think it's a realistic assessment of where we are, given we're leaving the European Union. I thought the speech was very good. It was balanced. It recognised that we couldn't continue having the same level of access as now, because if we did, we effectively wouldn't be leaving. Right,
so why did the Brexit Secretary always say we'll have exact same benefits of leaving the EU as we had when we were in the single market?
Well, I think what the Brexit Secretary meant and what the Prime Minister said in her speech last week was that we're going to have a deep and special trade relationship. We are going to be signing up to broadly common standards. And that's a critical thing to say, because it means we can trade freely if we accept our regulatory standards are going to be broadly equivalent to the European Union.
Broadly equivalent, but not as high?
No, but certainly not as high. In fact, she said in some areas, like workers' rights, environmental standards, she would expect UK standards to be even higher than European standards, as they currently are. But the point is, they're not going to be identical. They're going to be broadly equivalent, with an independent body, not the ECJ, deciding whether they're equivalent or not. And that means we can continue to trade pretty freely, and that's very important.
I mean, it was a reality check for Brexiteers, wasn't it? The ECJ, the European Court of Justice, will still arbitrate over certain things, will still be signed up to some of the key European agencies. It was a realistic approach, as you said, because the UK government's realised they can't get what they want.
Well, I don't think the European Court of Justice will be arbitrating. I think its judgments will have some influence in some of the bodies that we're still part of. It was a balanced and a realistic speech that lays the foundations for a really good free trade deal. I'm delighted she made it.
Do you accept that?
No, it's just chaotic, isn't it?
In what way?
Because we're not that much further forward, because Theresa May can't commit herself absolutely, because she will one faction in her party, either the pro-Brexit extremists or the Remainers, will suddenly say, well, that's it. So she has to keep the show going. But she'll say, on the one hand, we're not going to sign up to any of those terrible things like the customs union or the single market. But on the other hand, I want us to have the best possible deal that's going. Well, it doesn't mean anything.
Well, what's Labour promising your constituents? I mean, will your constituents say that Labour has a better policy in terms of its promises of a customs union?
And my constituents, I think, know that, which is probably why my majority trebled at the last election.
Yeah, but they don't want to be part of the single market, do they?
Well, Jeremy moved the party significantly. Jeremy's speech was significant last week because it committed us to the customs union.
And
there is very little difference between those two. What he's saying is that we want to replicate the customs union and, as far as possible, the single market as well. Now, those are significant moves in the direction of travel which the party is going.
Do you think Jeremy Corbyn will sign up to a single market membership?
I think it's possible that we will move further as time goes on, but it's the indications that he's given so far that we want to maintain the advantages that we had as members of the EU.
Right.
Well, he would say, while respecting the referendum result.
You can't both retain all of the advantages and also at the same time leave. And you must feel a bit sore, because he fired you, didn't he, about a year ago?
I mean, you were sacked
for advocating customs union membership.
I don't feel sore about it. I'm delighted that we're now advocating that policy.
Yeah, but on the basis that you wanted a single market membership, and he said you can no longer be part of the team.
The job that I think that Keir Starmer and Jeremy are doing is in recognising that if we want to be a successful trading country, we're going to have to stay on the closest possible terms with the EU, and they're making pragmatic decisions. But what you get from Theresa May is just bones thrown to these lunatic fringe, the Rees-Moggites and so forth, just to say, oh, we're still going to be a hard Brexit anti-European party, while admitting that is going to sit as...
Let's talk about the City of London. London, because a City of London financial services is an important part of the economy. And Theresa May said we're not looking for passporting because we understand this is intrinsic to the single market, of which we would no longer be a member. It would also require us to be subject to a single rule book over which we would have no say. That's going to be very damaging, isn't it, to the City of London?
But if you read the very next paragraph in the speech, which I'm sure we both have, she goes on to say that we would commit to having regulatory standards that were of equivalent levels.
Yeah. If that's acceptable to the EU.
Well, I don't see why it wouldn't be, because they book over half of their debt and equity issuance in London. So they really would be cutting off their nose to spite their faces.
How would that be the same as passporting, which the City of London has now?
Well, it would give us financial services access, providing that an independent body found that our regulatory standards were of a broadly equivalent standard to the Europeans, which we would expect them to be, because in many ways our regulatory standards are higher.
So, so that is passporting, isn't it?
Well, it gives you market access without having to be part of the single market and signing up to the last dot and last comma of every single rule. But I must say, I think Andy's characterisation a moment ago of the speech as sort of throwing bones to Jacob, who, by the way, I don't think eats bones.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, this is.
Was rather unfair, because I thought this speech, if you read it carefully, it is very realistic and it recognises where we need to make concessions and it recognises where the European Union does. I think it was actually very realistic and very balanced, and I think it will provide the foundations for a sensible free trade deal that works for them and works for us.
Chris, you have to say that. You were a Remainer, you were a Remainer, and I suspect you realise this is all nonsense. What we've done is we've rejected the advantages we had of being in the EU, and now we're trying to sign up to second-best versions of them.
But people voted to leave, Andy Slaughter, didn't they? And the point is, one of your colleagues, Frank Field, said people like you have ratted and are ratting on Labour leavers.
Frank Field is one of half a dozen Labour MPs who doesn't agree with the direction of travel that the Labour Party has. The Labour Party is actually very united on this issue. Theresa May has two problems. One is, how does she square leaving the EU with the economic success of the country? But she's got that additional problem that all Tory leaders have had, back to John Major, which is, how do you reconcile the irreconcilable Ken Clarke and Rees-Mogg?
Let's leave it there. Now, Westminster is regarded as the jewel in the crown of local government in London. The Conservatives have been in power there for as long as the City of Westminster has existed in its current form. The opposition claim the council is out of touch and in hock to the privileged, but they're now hitting back with a policy to raise money from the rich. Will that be enough to save them from the predicted Labour upsurge in inner London? Tanjil Rashid reports.
Westminster has some pretty well-to-do residents, the Queen for one, but it's not all swans and stucco-fronted terraces. It has the highest number of rough sleepers in the country, one of whom recently died yards from Parliament.
The City of Westminster has long been divided. With a diverse population and a large number of council estates, the North tends to vote Labour and returns a Labour MP to Parliament. But then you have the rather more affluent Tory-leaning South, and the council as a whole has been Conservative-run since 1964. Now, if Labour want to take control here, as some polling indicates may happen, they need to win in places like this.
Well, both the election results last year, but also the polling done since then, shows a really dramatic shift to Labour, particularly in inner London. So the last bit of polling done showed a 13-point swing to Labour in inner London, and that is of a scale that will enable Labour potentially to take councils like Wandsworth and Westminster. If they manage to crack Westminster, something seismic is happening in British politics.
The Labour team are hoping to capitalise on local opposition to Brexit. They're fielding an EU citizen as a candidate.
Well, I meet other EU nationals all the time when I'm campaigning, and you see that they are very, very concerned about Brexit. And I think there's also the anger of Grenfell, which is round the corner from here.
There are people who've previously voted Conservative who are fed up with Brexit, fed up with a hard right Tory agenda nationally, and want to see something at a local level that represents their interests more directly.
In order to win, they do need to double the number of councillors they have. Labour currently have 15 to the Tories' 45. The swing that's being projected would be enough, but the Conservative leader of the council believes her party will weather the storm.
On the doorstep, we are being told that they are voting Conservative in Westminster. They may vote for Labour in the national elections, but many of them tell us in local elections they vote for us.
And she has an eye-catching policy to raise funds from Westminster's wealthy.
Over the last couple of years, wealthier residents have asked us consistently, why don't you put up your council tax? So this new voluntary contribution asks those in Band H to pay a bit more, consider paying a bit more. Their council tax bill for next year will be £833. We're suggesting another £833.
Some of those targeted by the scheme don't think it's a reliable way to fund the council.
The voluntary contribution, whilst very worthwhile, doesn't necessarily give the council any surety as to how much money they will have. It relies on goodwill, and being reliant on goodwill is a little bit like a coconut shy at the fairground. You don't know whether you're going to win that coconut or whether you're not going to win it.
The scheme will be confirmed by the council this week, and come the election in May, we'll see whether or not it's enough for Westminster to buck the trend and remain in Tory hands.
That was Tanjil Rashid reporting. Chris, the policy wonks there are saying there's a 13% inner London swing to Labour. Were we to see that, that would be enough for Labour to take Westminster for the first time. How worried are you?
Well, I think we've all seen how accurate opinion polls are at the last election and at the referendum.
So you don't believe them?
And, well, look, I mean, let's wait until the election actually happens. But I think Westminster City Council have an incredibly strong story. They charge the lowest Band D council tax in the country. It's less than half their immediate neighbour, Labour-controlled Camden, and yet their services are excellent.
So why are Labour doing so well?
Well, I mean, we don't know they're doing so well. They collect the bins twice a week in Westminster. In Croydon, my borough, Labour-run, bin collections have been cut. They've got the highest social mobility in the country. Their children's services are rated outstanding by Ofsted, whereas in Croydon, the Labour-run borough I'm from, the children's services have been found to be dangerous.
Right, you're giving me a list of what you see as the achievements of the council, but we've just heard there, you may say that we can't believe the polls, but look what happened in the general election in terms of, well, Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party did much better than people thought. So I say to you again, the last time this was a marginal area, you have to go back to Shirley Porter and the Homes for Votes scandal. So what is happening?
Well, look, I mean, I think Andy Slaughter alluded to it. Clearly, in the general election and national election, there were significant challenges for the Conservatives, especially in inner London. But this is a local election. It's about local issues, and Westminster Council, in common with Wandsworth and other Conservative councils, do a fantastic job delivering excellent services for low tax, unlike Labour-run councils like Croydon, where I'm from, who do a terrible job in things like children's services and collecting rubbish, while charging exorbitantly high council tax.
Right, there would still have to be an enormous swing. I mean, it may be great publicity to say that Labour may take the scalp of a council that you have never held in recent time, but it is actually unrealistic.
Well, I note a note of desperation in Chris's voice, and the fact that Labour is trying to win Westminster very seriously, which it is, and it has great representation. It has a fantastic MP in Karen Buck. It has a great opposition there. But you're right, it is a very big ask, because you're asking them to go from having a quarter of the seats to winning. But there is a chance, but it will take a lot of work, and it will take a big turnout from voters, like the EU voters we heard from them, but also from people who, and I'm sorry, but Chris absolutely gets it wrong about Westminster. It is a terrible council. It has it has the 6th highest child poverty in the country. People think it's a wealthy area. It's not. And yet they've taken £10 million in the last 2 years.
But as you say, still unrealistic for Labour then to actually win it. I mean, could you sit here today and say, we're going to win that?
You're very stupid to predict the results of elections. People weren't predicting that Labour would take Hammersmith 3 years ago, and we did, and we are the only council since then to actually cut council tax during that time in London. So, and I hope that we will win again on our record. But the Tory record in Westminster is terrible, particularly on housing.
All right.
They're one of the worst achieving councils in terms of providing affordable housing in London.
How do you judge this policy from the leader of the council, who's asking the richest residents to pitch in with a voluntary tax? Do you support that?
Well, this is more desperate amateur stuff, isn't it? You cannot run government on the basis of charity. Look, the real crisis in local government is because every council has at least a third of its budget cut by the cuts in central government. During the austerity period, central government rather cowardly chose to cut local government rather than cutting some of its own services.
Is this just a gimmick? I mean, would you like your constituents, your richest constituents, to pay around £850 a year more, donate it to council coffers?
Well, I mean, look, I'm always in favour of trying new things. I think you've got to be, flexibly minded. And let's give it a try. Let's give it a try and see what happens. I'd be perfectly happy for Croydon Council to do that. In fact, the Conservatives on Croydon Council have proposed exactly this measure. But let's take Westminster as an example. They've got, you know, on housing, which Andrew mentioned, we've got 415 homeless places, overnight shelter places in Westminster, the highest in the country. There are 7 teams of people going around every night in Westminster actively trying to help homeless people. So I think Westminster have a very proud record of delivering great services for low council tax, and that's why they deserve to get re-elected, because that's what these elections are about.
Why not just put up council tax? I mean, this system, which Andy Slaughter has said is a gimmick, really, it's a charity, rather than a charitable donation, rather than setting up a new system, why not just put up the council tax? Why didn't you advise Westminster to do that?
Well, it's up to Westminster to set their own level of council tax.
Would that be better?
But if they felt they absolutely needed to rely on that money to run their services, I'm sure they would put their council tax up. But this is a voluntary measure to provide additional services, and people can choose whether to pay it.
A good idea for the rich to pitch in.
Look, it's a joke. You cannot run government on the charity of individuals. Street homelessness has gone up 140% since the Tories got back into government. There are 2,500 families in temporary accommodation in Westminster. It's a shambles, and this sort of gimmick isn't going to convince anybody.
Let's move on. This week, the Labour MP for Bermondsey and Old Southwark, Neil Coyle, wrote to EU citizens in his constituency. He urged them to regard the upcoming local elections as a referendum on the Prime Minister's handling of the Brexit negotiations and to vote for Labour accordingly. Sebastian Ash has more.
Over 1 million EU citizens in London are eligible to vote in local council elections on May 3rd. London's Mayor Sadiq Khan has called on them to
send the Tory government a message that we don't want their chaotic, extreme, hard Brexit approach.
And in a letter targeted at EU citizens in his constituency, Labour MP for Bermondsey and Old Southwark Neil Coyle has said,
as someone from an EU member state, you have to vote in the local election. This will be a major chance to send Theresa May's government a clear message about a disastrous Brexit policy and how it affects you and our whole community.
The party's commitment this week to staying in a customs union with the EU could win votes in the capital, and with significant EU populations in swing councils like Wandsworth and Barnet, their votes could make all the difference. But the EU citizens' rights group, the 3 Million, have said,
the jury is out on Labour because they supported Article 50.
Joining me now, Costanza de Toma from the organisation, the 3 Million, just mentioned there, which lobbies on behalf of EU citizens' rights. You say Labour can't be trusted, so who are you advocating EU citizens should vote for?
Well, I think that the key thing to say is that we would like EU nationals to vote, first and foremost. We're not telling anybody who to vote for, but we are talking to our members, to our fellow EU nationals, to be active citizens, so to keep councillors accountable, make them accountable to us as they would to any other constituents. So we're equipping them with questions to ask when they're being canvassed at their doorstep.
But do you get that this will be a sense, a referendum on Brexit, these elections?
Well, of course it will, but it's not about whether you're for or against Brexit. Like the 3 Million, for instance, doesn't in itself take a position on Brexit. What we're here to do is safeguard citizens' rights. So if there is a Tory-run council that will provide excellent services, information services, outreach, and to register all EU nationals, then why not support that?
What's the mood music, though, coming back from the members you've spoken to?
There is a certain level of distrust in the current government, I have to say. But, you know, equally, I think we've heard a lot of noise, we've heard a lot of reassurances, but they've been empty reassurances. What we need is actions, and we need actions at the local level. We are talking about local elections, and luckily we have a vote at the local level.
What is this distrust based on in terms of EU citizens' rights? Because the government, and no doubt Chris Philp, would say that those rights are going to be guaranteed, and even during the implementation and transition period, that now they will have indefinite leave to remain, although other rights may change.
Well, exactly. That's the devil is in the detail. We won't be keeping the same rights that we have now, and what the government has proposed is a lesser immigration status with fewer rights.
Right. I mean, she's just being realistic, Costanza, saying that there is a level of mistrust in the government, and that's hardly surprising based on past rhetoric.
Well, let's start with the local question, because she asked about what local councils are doing. Now, Westminster City Council, that we were just discussing, are running an outreach event tomorrow, Monday, which EU nationals are invited to, where they can have all of their rights and the processes explained. They're already doing in Westminster, a Conservative-controlled council, an enormous programme of outreach, exactly as you just requested.
So what about the level of trust in terms of citizens' rights?
That'll be recognised. Look, as far as the wider national rights are concerned, at the Stage 1 agreement back on the 8th of December, the Prime Minister and the European Union made it very clear that European citizens here would have the right to stay, obviously, and after 5 years living here would be able to get settled status, and after 10 years become full citizens. And in fact, those people would also have the right to bring over close family members. So I think that is a generous offer, which shows that we really do want European Union citizens to stay here and continue making the phenomenal contribution they've been making for the last, 10, 20 or 30 years.
Does that convince you?
It's in black and white in the agreement.
I'm afraid it doesn't. It's not what we have now. It's less than what we have now.
So,
and it's
the logic
not in black and white yet.
The logic of your argument is that your members are probably more likely to vote for Labour then, as many other Londoners.
No, I wouldn't say so. We haven't heard reassurances from Labour either. There have been very unfortunate votes on our rights in the Commons that Labour haven't. They haven't supported citizens' rights. And to be honest, remaining in a customs union would make no difference to freedom of movement.
And that's the point. Labour can't be trusted on this issue either, because they've been very opaque. There has been a move in terms of saying that we would be part of a customs union if Labour was the government. But in every other sense, you voted to leave the EU.
I think 3 Million Group are doing a very good job, and I think it's right to be even-handed and to encourage people to vote. I think that's the first important thing to be said.
Is that an acceptance that Labour aren't doing anything more for EU citizens than the Tories?
Absolutely not. And this is the thing that most animates me about the whole Brexit debate. More than 1 in 5 of my voters is an EU citizen. I speak to many of them every week, knocking on doors. They are very, very upset, traumatised, I would say, about the fact they're being treated as second-class citizens, and they feel they do not have a future.
Give me examples of how they're treated like second-class citizens.
Well, what we've just talked about, settled status is not the same as the rights they have now.
So you're talking about the transition period, and when people arrive after March 2019?
No. Settled status. There are going to be. This is part of the confusion. There can be at least 5 different types of rights you have. You might be waiting to acquire settled status, have settled status. In the transition period, we now find out, contrary to what Theresa May led us to believe, you will not have the right to settled status. You will have the right to indefinite leave to remain after a period. I mean, I barely understand this. Most of the people I'm talking to don't understand it, and they're being treated in an absolutely appalling way by this government.
Right,
and that's why I think that people will remember that when they go and vote in May, because this is. Can you imagine treating any other group, any other national group or ethnic group like this?
Chris Philp, are you on a sticky wicket in London, which is seen as a Remain city on the basis of what Costanza has said, and listening to Andy Slaughter, this is going to be extremely difficult in these local elections for you?
No, we're not on a sticky wicket. Now, clearly the Labour Party, Andy, and we saw that letter there from Neil Coyle, are attempting to scaremonger to win votes at the May election. But the truth is, European Union citizens are welcome here. We want them to stay.
That's empty words.
Let me finish. There is a very clear path to acquiring not just permanent right to stay, but full British citizenship, which we expect the vast majority of European Union citizens to do. They're welcome to stay here. We're making it easy to stay here, and they'll continue making a huge contribution. And it's in black and white. It's in the agreement on the 8th of December. It's in the draft withdrawal agreement, 117 pages, published by the European Commission last Wednesday.
All right.
It is there in black and white.
We're going to have to finish it there. Costanza, thank you very much for coming in. But that's all we've got time for the London part of the show. My thanks to you for being my guests of the day. Bye-bye.